It has been a busy week in Washington with President Trump returning home after his first international trip since taking over the presidency. But it has not been a quiet week in the least, with the announcement of the U.S. dropping out of the Paris Climate Accord, investigations into Russian election interference, the anticipation of fired FBI Director James Comey preparing to testify to Congress, plus the tweet that has a lot of people scratching their heads. What is covfefe? We'll be talking about that since it is Friday, so we have to lighten up the mood just a little bit. The president of the Sarasota Republican Club, Rod Thompson, is here, the editor of the Sarasota Business Observer, Mark Gordon, and presidential elections author, Mark Weston. They all join us now with their thoughts. And first of all, gentlemen, thank you for being here with us. And I want to talk first of all about the Paris Climate Accord. And of course, we're going to get into why President Trump decided to exit that. But first of all, Mark, can you talk about what it is? I think some people are vehemently for or against it, and they don't even know exactly all the details.
The Paris Climate Accord is a series of voluntary agreements agreed to by 195 countries, every country in the world except for Syria, Nicaragua, and now the United States. The United States promised that it would reduce carbon emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025, but there's no enforcement mechanism. Other countries made similar promises. One of the complaints about the Paris Accord is that China gets to keep on polluting for another decade, and India can still build some coal plants and is going to get a lot of foreign aid. But what people don't understand is what different places the different countries came from to get to this agreement. So China and India are far, far poorer than we are. And they said, look, you guys have been polluting for decades and been getting fully rich and industrialized. We're just beginning our industrialization. We don't want to stop. So there was a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromise. That's what you get in an international agreement. And the Chinese said, all right, in the year 2030, we will start to have our limits on pollution. And so everybody, has given themselves goals, and the agreement was a floor, not a ceiling. It was easy to poke. Clearly, the agreement by itself is not enough to undo climate change, but it was a floor, and it was a framework that every country in the world was part of until now.
So, Rod, let's talk about why maybe President Trump would decide to pull out of this.
At least a dozen good reasons for pulling out of it. Let's start with China starting in 2030. That's actually when the agreement technically ends, is 2030. So, I mean, I don't think that was very toughly negotiated. I think we have another situation where it was a negotiation that was extremely poor for the United States. Trump campaigned on pulling out of it. This is a campaign promise kept. He was elected, and that was one of the reasons he would have been elected. The accords themselves, as Mark said, are not enforceable. They're all voluntary. 195 nations, if you look at some of them, Pakistan said we might do something after we meet our maximum amount of production of carbon so that they can maximize their own economy. But they're part of the accords, and we're not a part of it. So this whole agreement is toothless, and it was the MIT study that the president quoted when he said that if everybody kept to it as they promised they would in it, it would lower carbon emissions, temperatures due to carbon emissions by 0.2 degrees in 100 years, which is clearly not going to have hardly any impact whatsoever. And that was if everybody kept it, which nobody thinks that would happen. So there was no reason to do this other than to economically harm the United States. There's a reason why a lot of people wanted us to take the biggest hit, and it's not just because we are the biggest carbon emission producer. We have the biggest economy. We're just cranking it. So it makes sense that we would. But it's not just because that. It puts us at an economic disadvantage. He knew that. And I would say politically, Haley, he took a step towards re-election because Pennsylvania and Ohio is deeply impacted by coal production, by shale production, by natural gas production. And he just opened up the opportunity for hundreds of thousands of jobs in those states. So there's a lot of good reasons that we should have pulled out of this, and very little to lose by doing so.
And of course, there's some who will say, coal is dying and employs very few people, but we can get to that later. I just want to get Mark's take on what the Sarasota business community, we only have about 30 seconds left, but what their response has been at this point.
Sure. I think there's some sort of confusion and not understanding exactly what the agreement is and why pulling out matters or why staying in it would matter. I think the Sarasota business community wants certainty in what they're going to be doing. They want to know what their tax bill is going to be. They want to know what the health care bill is going to be. So I think their focus more is on domestic politics than international politics.
All right, we're just getting started. We will pick right back up with this discussion after a check on our forecast. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are discussing This Week in Washington. Our guests tonight are the president of the Sarasota Republican Club, Rod Thompson, the editor of the Sarasota Business Observer, Mark Gordon, and presidential elections author, Mark Weston. So when we were talking earlier, we had kind of finished on a statement by Rod and Mark about the Paris Accord. And now I know, Mark, you want an opportunity to respond with some of your thoughts.
Yesterday, the Republicans took a slow-acting suicide pill. They're going to be seen as the party that is not in favor of preserving the earth, and it's going to kill them unless the moderates rise up and rebel against President Trump. President Trump has not even admitted that there is a climate change problem when 99.9% of the peer-reviewed journal articles about climate say that mankind is contributing to climate change. If the Antarctic ice sheets continue to melt at the rate that they're melting, this will not be an international issue. It will be a local issue. We will lose parts of Sarasota. We will lose parts of Miami. So I have to ask, where is Senator Rubio? Where is Congressman Buchanan? They should be out there today denouncing Trump for withdrawing from this accord.
What are your thoughts, though, on the statement he made that he would be open to renegotiating the deal in a way that would be more beneficial to the United States?
Well, the leaders of England, France, and Germany have already said that the deal will not be renegotiated. When you have 195 nations in a deal, you don't get to renegotiate it.
I did hear them say that, but I also thought, under what authority, is that, what statement authority do they have to make that statement? Why can't the U.S. come in and say, let's bring it back to the table? Why are they kind of cutting off the negotiations?
Well, there's something to be said for keeping your word. If you agree to have an agreement, the rest of the world's going to say, look, this is the agreement we agreed to. You can't just leave the table and come back and want more.
Which is why, when we have agreements that are usually called treaties, they are approved by the Senate. So President Trump did not agree to this treaty. President Obama did on his own, and then we call it not a treaty, like we did with the Iran nuke agreement, so that it wouldn't have to go through the Senate. The same thing there. Look, one of the big issues with this, really, and some people consider it the biggest one, some constitutionalists consider it the biggest one, is that this is in principle a loss of sovereignty because of the authority that other nations could have on the U.S. and on the U.S. economy and on decisions the U.S. makes regarding the U.S. economy and emissions. Now, since it's voluntary, probably not. That's why it's in principle a real big problem. So the very idea, as Mark was pointing out rightly, that that Britain and France and England and Germany have all said, no, we're not going to restart it again, kind of makes that point, really. And so it seems to me that if Trump's main issue, and I don't know if it was, but if Trump's main issue is we got a bad deal like we have with China, like we have with Mexico, like we did with Iran, he thinks we just got a bad deal and is willing to renegotiate it, them saying no, well, that makes them somewhat complicit in it, unless there's more to their reasoning for wanting the deal than simple global warming.
I also think it could be a little bit, and going to Mark's point, a little bit overstated in the sense it's a big deal now and it's important, it's in the news cycle now, but if Trump's talked about 3% GDP, 4% or even 5%. If a year from now the economy is moving again and there are more jobs, as Rod mentioned earlier, the fact that he pulled out of this agreement I don't think is going to hurt him in re-election. If he can get the economy rolling again, this will be a 24-hour news cycle blip to him.
And where do you all see his stance on climate change? He hasn't really been all that forthcoming about a hardline stance since he was elected. On the campaign trail, he did occasionally call it a hoax. We had at least one statement that he said that, but he hasn't necessarily taken that hard line since he's been elected.
I don't think he has. I don't know if he's going to or not. I mean, on the campaign trail, he was careless with a lot of things that he said, right. And that was certainly one of them that he was careless with. But that doesn't really change what things are. When you'd asked about the politics, I really disagree on the political impact of it with what Mark Weston was saying, because actually I think it would have been politically disastrous for him not to have pulled out of it, being in touch with his base, as I am. I think that would have been a big mistake. And Mark Gordon is right in that this is very short term, because his re-election will more than likely hinge on the economy and the strength of the economy. It normally is about the economy, and it would take something extraordinary like war with North Korea or something like that for it not to be about the economy. It is not going to be changed at all based on the Paris Accords.
Even if Trump is reelected, which I do not think is going to happen, if the Republicans do not change their position on climate change, it is still a suicide pill.
Well, I'll just say that the Paris Accords were not going to impact climate change hardly at all, even by MIT's own analysis of it.
All right, so let's move on to our next topic. What can we expect from Comey's testimony? Do we think, A, that these hearings are going to happen? There's talk that maybe the White House would kind of try to intercede. But what do we think is going to come out of this? Let's start with Mark.
I assume the White House is not dumb enough to ban Comey from testifying. They would just look so guilty if they do. But when Comey testifies and contradicts Trump on how the White House conversations went, I don't think very many people are going to believe Trump. Trump's reputation for accuracy is dismal, and Comey is a very reputable figure. So I think of the Richard Pryor quote, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" Once Comey speaks, people will accept that as the reality of what actually happened at the White House.
I think on that front, there's confirmation bias. I think when Comey testifies, you're going to have people who, I knew that all along. I knew that. That's exactly what he did on one side of the political aisle. On the other side, you're going to have people saying, well, this is a witch hunt and sort of the Trump position. So I think there's a lot of confirmation bias whenever he will testify.
If Comey confirms what has been leaked already and nothing more than that, then there's really nothing to it. Nothing changes really, because the confirmation bias is just right. People are going to hear what they're going to hear. Mark Weston and I will watch those proceedings the exact same, hear the exact same things, and have different conclusions from them. And that's pretty representative of the American public right now.
Right, I agree with that.
You may be right that whatever Comey says next week will not be impeachable. It won't change the fundamental politics of day to day. But we've got Robert Mueller as the independent counsel, and he's going to be investigating everything, and nothing really can stop him. So we are going to have a full investigation of all this, and there may be stuff there and there may not, but we're going to have a full investigation.
And speaking of that, let's get to Jared Kushner. He's been somewhat, I would say, of a mysterious figure in the Trump administration. He's been assigned to a lot, but we don't hear from him very often. We don't really know where he stands on a lot of issues, or how he was involved in any dealings with Russia or at all. So what are your thoughts? Give everyone a chance to respond to this, but what are your thoughts? Are they going to dig up anything on Jared Kushner, and is he in the right position where he should be? Should he have stepped away as this investigation is going on?
I think he's in a terrible position. I wish Jared Kushner was not involved in White House in any way other than visiting for family affairs. I don't think he has any role he should play. He's historically, his views have been liberal Manhattan Democrat. That is not what anybody who voted for Trump wants. Jared Kushner has no experience in these things. He has nothing to recommend him in being involved with these things. I wish he would just stay away, and I wish he and Ivanka would both stay away from the White House, go make a ton of money doing something, and stay out of the politics of things that are not really reflective of the president's winning base. That said, the concern here is the constant concern that we have is that if you can insert Russia into anything dealing with the White House in any way, it immediately becomes the story du jour for the next 24 hours, no matter how nothing there is to it. My guess is we're going to find that a guy who was involved with global real estate around the world and selling to people from around the world probably had dealings with people in Russia, probably with bankers specifically in Russia. So whether they tie something nefarious to him or not, we'll see. But my suspicion is no. My suspicion is it's going to be just like it's been all along with Russia, a whole lot of smoke and no fire, a whole lot of nothing that is in the realm of actual evidence, just like James Clapper, which was Obama's, director of national intelligence, just said a week ago. There is no evidence suggesting collusion. I suspect this is just going to be more of the same of that. And Mueller could change that equation. The special prosecutor Mueller could change that equation, and we'll have to wait and see on that. But so far, there's nothing there.
All right. Thoughts on Jared Kushner?
Well, if there's really nothing there, then let the president release his tax returns. What are his financial dealings with the Russians? Let's find out. Maybe he releases his tax returns and there's no financial dealings at all, although then you'd have to wonder if the discussions were political. But I think at the very least, if we could see those tax returns, we'd know a lot more.
And your final thoughts on that?
I think if you're Donald Trump, it's almost good to have Jared Kushner there in a sense that, his presidency has been marked by leaks, and maybe Kushner's somebody who's not leaking and he can trust more than some of the other people. So I think there's an advantage to him having Jared Kushner there, but I agree with what you said. There's a mystery as to what exactly his role is and how deep it goes on each issue.
Right. Well, we'll take a quick break and then we return with our final thoughts from our guest tonight. Now for some final thoughts from our guest tonight. I said it was Friday. We were going to have a little bit of fun. So in our final thoughts, if you would like to give your opinion or your thoughts on the tweet seen around the world, this is it right here. Despite the constant negative press, Kofefe. That's turned into so many different memes online and funny things, and everyone's had fun with it. So if you have any thoughts on what that was it a typo? Was it something else? Feel free to share that. And if you have any other thoughts on the topics tonight, feel free to share those too. We'll start with Mark.
I think it was a typo for the word coverage. My final thought is with Scott Pruitt, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, when they ask him, do you believe that there's climate change? And he says, I'm not a scientist. This seems to be the standard Republican soundbite, to which the obvious reply is, you don't have to be a scientist, just read the scientific journals.
All right, Mark, your final thoughts.
Sure. Going back to the tweet, you know, I think there's been a lot of talk about maybe him tweeting less, and I think he probably should do that, regardless of your political opinions on it. His way of communicating his message has not always worked to his advantage. So less tweets from Trump is better.
And maybe less tweets when you're sleepy and you're
Yes,
kind of getting a little...
not recognizing what you're typing.
Right.
Definitely better.
Right. And Rod, your final thoughts.
Please, dear Lord, fewer tweets from the president. I think it shows the failings of autocorrect. Let's blame autocorrect for that.
Right.
Yeah, it was coverage. Clearly, he was going for coverage, and he just, whacked it out there. I think that one of the problems that we have with the climate change situation, and we've talked about this on Alan's show before, is that there are some of us that just distrust the data at the bottom because of the known public scandals we've had out of England and other places among climate scientists who have changed the data to make it look worse, which makes us then wonder if we can. And then on the Paris Accords, can we trust the reporting of it? Because there is that video when it was signed of the reporters and the press pool there, of about 40 of them that were covering it, that jumped up and clapped and cheered and hugged each other and danced when it was passed. So I'm not sure that I can trust any of this. We had a climate scientologist on earlier out of St. Pete, and he was great to talk to about it and to hear about it. But just as a regular reader of these things and reading things, there is so much to question on it.
All right.
Particularly the man-made part of it, the degree that it's man-made.
All right.
99.9% of the peer-reviewed journals.
And we can talk about that stat another time because it's easily debunkable.
Another time because we are having to wrap up. Yes, feel free to continue this off air. And if you enjoyed tonight's discussion and you want to watch past roundtable discussions, you can do that on demand. And we will be back with your forecast.